In the winter of 1940, deep inside the marble corridors of Berlin, the air was thick with smoke, maps sprawled across polished tables, and the crackle of confidence in every voice. To the generals of Hitler's Reich, America was a nation not worth fearing. In their eyes, the United States was a distracted democracy. Its army scarcely ranked among the top 20 in size. Its air force little more than a token wing of undertrained pilots and outdated machines. German officers laughed at the thought of American power. "They are a nation of amateurs," one colonel sneered in a private gathering. Across the Reich, propaganda echoed this belief. America, they said, was soft, too busy with movies, jazz, and automobiles to master the grim realities of war. Hitler himself dismissed the very notion of American rearmament. The Führer insisted that Germany's Luftwaffe, already triumphant over Poland and France, would hold supremacy in the skies indefinitely. To him, America was incapable of matching the discipline, science, and efficiency of German industry. And yet, the perception was an illusion. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke with quiet urgency. In his December 1940 Arsenal of Democracy address, broadcast over the radio waves, he warned Americans that the war in Europe was not distant, but creeping ever closer. Factories that once rolled out Buicks and Packards were already receiving government contracts. Engineers sketched the frames of bombers onto drafting boards, while unions debated the coming wave of rearmament. The United States was still neutral, still divided between isolationists and interventionists. But the tempo was shifting. In Detroit and Chicago, idle factories hummed faintly with preparation. At the time, the numbers were small. In 1939, American factories had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft, a mere fraction of Germany's growing fleet. But Roosevelt and his advisors saw the potential of an industrial base unmatched in size and scope. The contrast was striking. In Berlin, confidence. In America, restlessness. German intelligence reported back to the Reich Chancellery with thinly veiled disdain. Reports suggested American workers lacked discipline, that their factories were plagued by inefficiency, and that unions would cripple any effort to scale production. "Even if they try," one Luftwaffe officer wrote in 1940, "the Americans cannot produce more than a trickle compared to our rivers of steel." But beneath the dismissals, something remarkable was stirring. Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, a bold maneuver that allowed American factories to funnel arms to Britain and, eventually, the Soviet Union. Shipments of tanks, rifles, and aircraft began crossing the Atlantic. For German officers reading intelligence briefs, it was dismissed as a desperate gesture, not the prelude to a flood. Still, the tide was rising. Eyewitness accounts from Berlin capture the tone of arrogance. A diary entry from a Wehrmacht aide, written in late 1940, paraphrased the mood. They laughed when Roosevelt promised to build 50,000 planes. They said the Americans would never find the hands to rivet them, nor the pilots to fly them. Laughter rippled in smoke-filled rooms where the Reich's commanders believed themselves invincible. And yet, while they laughed, the clock ticked. In Detroit, Henry Ford quietly announced plans for a vast new facility at Willow Run, designed to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber on an assembly line as if it were a Model T. Across the country, Boeing accelerated its work on the B-17 Flying Fortress. The numbers were still small, but the gears were turning. Cinematic imagery tells the tale of contrast. In Berlin, the sound of champagne glasses clinking in celebration of victories across Europe. In America, the low rumble of dormant factories, waiting to ignite. The hook of this story lies in underestimation. A nation dismissed as soft would awaken with fury. A country mocked as incapable would soon outbuild, outfly, and overwhelm. The laughter of 1940 would give way, in only a few short years, to the stunned silence of German officers watching thousands of American planes streak across their skies. For now, in the closing months of 1940, the Reich was triumphant, and the Eagles slept. But in Detroit, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, the Eagle's wings were already being forged. And soon, those wings would darken the sky. The laughter in Berlin had not yet faded when history shifted. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft roared across the skies of Oahu. striking Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. Within hours, battleships lay smoldering in the harbor, smoke curling into the Hawaiian sun. By the next day, Roosevelt stood before Congress, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States was now at war. And with war came awakening. Factories that had once rolled out gleaming Buicks, Fords, and Chevrolets began to roar with a new rhythm. In Detroit, General Motors shifted to building tanks and aircraft engines. Chrysler retooled for armored vehicles, while Ford undertook its most audacious project, constructing Willow Run, a sprawling complex in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Designed to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber, it became the largest factory under one roof in the world. At its peak, Willow Run turned out one bomber every 63 minutes, an achievement that stunned even its skeptics. The statistics alone told a story of transformation. In 1939, the United States had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1942, production had surged to 47,800 planes. By 1944, the number soared past 96,000 in a single year. Tanks, artillery, rifles, and ammunition followed the same exponential curve. America's industrial base, once dismissed as sluggish and unfocused, had become a machine of war. But this transformation was not only mechanical, it was human. Millions of workers streamed into the factories. Men left farms, offices, and schools to take up welding torches and riveting guns. Women stepped into roles once reserved for men, earning the nickname Rosie the Riveter. Posters urged them on. We can do it. The clang of steel, the hiss of welding arcs, and the pounding of presses filled the air. Assembly lines became battlefields of their own, where the enemy was time and the weapon was speed. One worker later recalled the atmosphere. The factory never slept. The shifts blurred together, the machines thundered, and you felt like every rivet you drove might save a pilot's life. Across the country, from Seattle's Boeing plants to California's shipyards, the sound of industry became the soundtrack of war. Government coordination made it possible. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, rationed materials, allocated contracts, and ensured that America's industrial power was focused on victory. Civilian automobile production ceased entirely. Tires, gasoline, and rubber were rationed, forcing the population to adjust their lives. But few complained. Sacrifice became a badge of honor. The sheer scale of mobilization was staggering. At Willow Run, workers walked more than a mile from one end of the assembly line to the other. Boeing churned out B-17 Flying Fortresses in Seattle and Wichita, while North American Aviation perfected the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that would later escort bombers deep into Germany. Shipyards along both coasts launched Liberty ships at breakneck speed, one every few days, keeping supply lines open to Britain and the Soviet Union. The arsenal of democracy had become more than a slogan. It was reality. Atmosphere defined this era as much as statistics. Train stations bustled with new arrivals, families leaving farms for defense jobs, migrants moving across states, and women carrying lunch pails beside men in work boots. Cities glowed at night with the light of factories running around the clock. The smell of oil, steel, and sweat hung heavy in the air. America itself became a front line, its industry as vital as any battlefield. Still, it was not easy. Production faced shortages, strikes, and setbacks. Engineers wrestled with bottlenecks. At Willow Run, the early months were plagued with problems, bombers rolling off the line unfit to fly. But persistence prevailed. By 1943, the kinks were ironed out, and the plant delivered thousands of aircraft that filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific. To the outside world, the transformation was breathtaking. Where once stood a peacetime economy, now loomed an industrial juggernaut capable of outproducing every Axis power combined. America had become the world's factory, and in Berlin, where officers once mocked, the reports from the front grew grimmer. Every new shipment, every fresh squadron, was proof that the United States was no longer sleeping. It was awake, and it was forging an arsenal the world had never seen before. The awakening of American industry had laid the foundation. Now, the products of that colossal effort began to take shape in steel and aluminum. What had started as sketches on drafting tables and models and wind tunnels became wings, fuselages, and engines, an arsenal of flight unlike any the world had ever seen. The diversity of American aircraft reflected both necessity and innovation. The Boeing B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, epitomized long-range endurance. With its defensive gun turrets bristling from nose to tail, it could absorb staggering amounts of damage and still return home. Production skyrocketed. By the end of the war, more than 12,700 B-17s had rolled out of factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and beyond. Pilots trusted it, crews revered it. One gunner later recalled, "It felt less like a plane and more like a steel guardian that wanted to bring us home." Even more ambitious was the B-29 Superfortress. Introduced in 1944, it represented the cutting edge of aviation technology: pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a range of over 3,000 miles. Built primarily by Boeing in Kansas and Washington, and by Bell and Martin under license, the B-29 required a level of precision never before attempted in mass production. More than 3,900 would be constructed, and they would ultimately carry the war to Japan's doorstep. But not all battles were fought at high altitude. The North American P-51 Mustang, sleek and fast, emerged as the war's game-changer in the skies over Europe. Initially underpowered, it was transformed when paired with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. With extended-range fuel tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into German territory, turning daylight raids from costly gambles into decisive assaults. Over 15,000 P-51s were built, and their arrival marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's decline. Contrails scarred the skies as bombers flew in tight formations, now shielded by swarms of agile fighters. Production statistics told a story of breathtaking scale. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings, distinctive with their twin-boom design. Republic Aviation built more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, rugged fighters that earned the nickname Jug. By 1945, American factories had delivered over 300,000 aircraft of every type: bombers, fighters, transports, and trainers, a figure that dwarfed Axis production. Behind each machine stood human effort. Test pilots pushed prototypes to their limits, sometimes paying with their lives. Factory workers poured themselves into their tasks, often describing the planes in personal terms. One assembly line worker wrote, "Each rivet I drove felt like a bullet fired back at Hitler." Engineers refined designs at relentless pace, shaving off weight, adding armor, and adjusting fuel systems to meet the demands of global war. Atmosphere charged every stage of the process. The deafening roar of radial engines tested on factory grounds shook nearby towns. The smell of hot oil and metal hung in the air as mechanics prepared squadrons for deployment. On American air bases, the sight of newly delivered bombers lined wingtip to wingtip gave aircrews both awe and reassurance. And across the Atlantic, German commanders who had once scoffed began to take note of the endless formations appearing on the horizon. By 1943, the transition from blueprints to battlefields was complete. What had been theoretical became tangible. American air power filled the skies in quantities and qualities once unimaginable. Steel wings carried the arsenal of democracy across oceans, from English fields to Pacific islands. And this was only the beginning. For while the aircraft were masterpieces of engineering, their true impact would be measured not in production numbers, but in combat. When the skies over Europe and the Pacific grew dark with squadrons of American bombers, and Germany was forced to confront an air armada that no amount of mockery could dismiss. By 1943, the roar of America's factories had become the thunder of wings over Europe. What had once been blueprints and promises were now vast formations of bombers and fighters, filling the skies with steel. For the first time in the war, Germany faced not just an enemy on the ground, but an armada above, relentless, organized, and seemingly endless. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, spearheaded the assault. Daylight raids became their hallmark, a strategy dismissed by many as reckless. Flying in tight box formations, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched across the sky, bristling with machine guns. The gamble was simple: Their defensive firepower, combined with sheer numbers, would hold against the Luftwaffe's interceptors. Each mission launched hundreds of aircraft, their contrails weaving a white lattice across the heavens. For the men on the ground in Germany, the sight was staggering. Diaries captured the shock. One civilian wrote, paraphrasing his disbelief, "We looked up and the sky was gone. It was nothing but silver shapes, row upon row, glinting in the sun." The Luftwaffe, once masters of the air, scrambled to respond. Operation Point Blank, launched in June 1943, aimed to cripple Germany's aircraft industry. Factories in Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen became targets. The raids were costly. In the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, more than 370 bombers took off. 60 were lost in a single day. Crews endured flak that shredded wings and cannon fire from Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Survivors described the carnage: bomb bays ablaze, engines torn away, parachutes blossoming against black smoke. Yet, even in loss, the raids signaled a new reality. America could replace its losses faster than Germany could shoot them down. For German pilots, the task was impossible. Every squadron scrambled, every resource stretched. The Luftwaffe's fighters dove into the bomber streams, guns blazing, only to be met by swarms of escorts. At first, the bombers flew unaccompanied deep into Reich territory, but by late 1943 the arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. With drop tanks extending their range, the Mustangs could escort bombers to Berlin itself. Sleek and deadly, they turned the tide of the air war. A Luftwaffe ace later admitted, when the Mustangs came, the war was lost. The sound of these raids became part of daily life in German cities. The drone of hundreds of engines grew louder until it shook the earth itself. Anti-aircraft guns barked from rooftops and fields, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. Fires raged below as bombs struck rail yards, factories, and refineries. Contrails scarred the blue above, marking the paths of formations so vast they seemed eternal. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was breaking. During Big Week in February, the Allies launched a concentrated series of raids against aircraft factories. Over 3,800 sorties hammered German industry. Fighter production slowed, repair shops were destroyed, and training programs faltered. Losses among Luftwaffe pilots mounted. The veterans of 1940 and 1941 were gone, replaced by green recruits who stood little chance against experienced American and British airmen. In Berlin, confidence crumbled. Reports delivered to the high command told of fuel shortages, ruined factories, and aircraft that never reached the front. Morale sagged. What had once been mockery of American industry now turned to grim acknowledgement. The United States was producing planes faster than the Reich could replace its losses. The turning point had come. Where once the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies, now it struggled merely to survive. Each new raid drove home the same truth: the sky belonged to the Allies. Germany's cities smoldered, its factories lay in ruins, and its pilots were dwindling with every mission. The eagle they once mocked had taken flight, and its wings blotted out the sun. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was overwhelmed. As American bombers carved contrails across European skies, the true weight of the arsenal of democracy was carried not only by pilots and gunners, but by millions of ordinary citizens who never set foot on a battlefield. Behind every B-17, every P-51, and every Liberty ship stood an army of workers whose battleground was the factory floor. The mobilization of the home front was unprecedented. By 1942, more than 15 million Americans had moved into defense industries. Assembly lines that once produced refrigerators or typewriters now churned out engines, tanks, and aircraft parts. The clang of steel presses, the hiss of welding torches, and the roar of testing bays became the daily soundtrack of a nation at war. Women formed the backbone of this transformation. As millions of men went overseas, women filled the void in factories and shipyards. They became welders, riveters, and machinists. The image of Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled, rivet gun in hand, captured the spirit of determination. One worker later recalled, "We felt the war in every bolt we tightened. We knew our boys depended on it." African American workers also played a crucial role, though they faced segregation and discrimination. At the Ford Willow Run plant, thousands of black laborers endured unequal pay and limited job opportunities. Yet their contribution was indispensable. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph pressed the government for fair treatment, leading to Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. It was a step forward, though struggles remained daily. Sacrifice was not confined to factory floors. Wartime rationing reshaped American life. Families surrendered sugar, meat, gasoline, and rubber. Tires were scarce, stockings disappeared, and car production ceased entirely. Victory gardens sprang up across backyards and city plots, supplementing food supplies. War bonds, advertised by movie stars and sold at corner stores, turned civilian savings into bombers and bullets. The war effort became personal. Every household felt its weight. Union tensions also surfaced. Strikes threatened production, and disputes flared between workers and management. Yet the sheer urgency of war often overpowered dissent. The War Labor Board mediated conflicts, ensuring that assembly lines kept moving. Engineers and managers pushed through sleepless nights, solving bottlenecks in production. At Boeing, draftsmen and mechanics worked shoulder to shoulder to meet impossible deadlines. At Willow Run, where one bomber rolled off the line every hour by 1944, fatigue was constant, but so was pride. Atmosphere defined the American home front. Cities pulsed with 24-hour life. Train stations overflowed with migrants chasing factory jobs. Cafeterias buzzed through the night as workers rotated shifts. Smoke poured from chimneys in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles, staining the sky with the exhaust of ceaseless industry. The war was visible, audible, tangible. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was stark. German factories, targeted relentlessly by Allied bombing campaigns, became shells of production. Workers there toiled under bombardment, their morale shattered. The Reich relied heavily on forced and slave labor. Prisoners of war, political captives, and civilians dragged from occupied territories. They labored under guard, starved and beaten, assembling weapons for a regime collapsing under its own brutality. In 1944 alone, millions of such workers filled Germany's factories, a grim reflection of desperation. Where American workers riveted with purpose, German laborers suffered under duress. Where U.S. factories grew stronger under sacrifice, German production faltered under ruin. This moral and material divide was as decisive as any dogfight. By 1944, the United States had achieved an industrial miracle. More than 18 million women had joined the workforce, producing tanks, planes, and ammunition at a pace unmatched in history. The nation's output not only equipped its own forces, but sustained its allies. Britain's skies were defended with American-built fighters, Soviet armies advanced with U.S. trucks and food, and the Pacific Island campaign surged forward with American ships and planes. The war in the skies was fought not just by pilots, but by those who never left the ground. Their sacrifices, in sweat, in sleepless nights, in ration lines, ensured that American industry outpaced every enemy. And as the air fleets expanded, Germany's horizon darkened further, setting the stage for the final onslaught that would seal the fate of the Reich. By 1945, the transformation was undeniable. In just 4 years of total war, the United States had produced more than 300,000 military aircraft, a figure so vast it defied imagination. Bombers, fighters, transports, and trainers rolled from assembly lines faster than Germany could destroy them. Entire fleets materialized seemingly overnight, filling airfields across Britain, France, and the Pacific Islands. For German officers who had once laughed at the notion of American power, the sight was sobering. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. Its aces were dead or exhausted, its training programs crippled, and its fuel reserves dwindling. By contrast, the skies above Germany were darkened daily by armadas of American bombers, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs. One German soldier recorded bitterly in his diary, "The sky is no longer ours. It belongs to them. Endless machines, endless fuel, endless men." The legacy of America's industrial awakening was not only measured in numbers, but in its symbolism. The so-called nation of amateurs, mocked in Berlin's command halls just a few years earlier, had become the decisive force in the air war. Airfields across England trembled with the roar of engines as waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted into the sky. In the Pacific, the B-29 Superfortress carried destruction across the vast ocean, culminating in the missions that brought the war to its final, catastrophic end. The imagery of the era was unforgettable. Contrails scarred the heavens in white lattices that stretched from horizon to horizon. Civilians and soldiers alike gazed upward in awe and dread as entire squadrons passed overhead, their engines beating a relentless rhythm. The eagle that Germany had once mocked now spread its wings so wide that it could not be ignored. But this triumph came with cost. American workers endured years of rationing, sleepless shifts, and constant pressure. More than 400,000 Americans lost their lives in combat. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins, their people broken by firestorms from the very bombers American factories had produced. The arsenal of democracy had been both savior and destroyer, a paradox written in smoke and steel. The war's end marked the beginning of a new era. The same industrial machine that had armed democracy now positioned the United States as a global superpower. Aircraft production slowed, but the infrastructure, technology, and workforce that had made 300,000 planes possible did not vanish. Instead, it shifted toward a Cold War footing. The jet age dawned, and the factories of World War II became the backbone of America's military-industrial complex. For Germany, the lesson was bitter. Industrial might had decided the war as surely as strategy or valor. The Luftwaffe's brilliance in 1940 could not withstand the flood of American steel by 1944. For the world, the warning was clear: never again underestimate the capacity of a democracy to mobilize when threatened. The story closes where it began, with the arrogance of underestimation. In 1940, German officers laughed at the idea that America could fight a modern war. By 1945, they stood beneath skies filled with American planes, their laughter long silenced by the thunder of engines. The eagle they mocked had awakened, and its wings filled the sky.